Hey everybody, 40 Sparky here. I asked the question a little bit ago about how to test the actual time that a shutter is actually open and how accurate it is compared to the setting that the camera is saying on a modern DSLR. I've come up with a kind of a makeshift homemade solution, and it revolves around this. This is actually a shutter timer. This was designed by a company called Northeast Instruments back in the 70s in Minneapolis. And it's simply a digital timer tied to a photocell. When the light level reaches a certain point, it starts the timer, and when it drops off, it stops. It is also self-resetting, so when the light level comes back up, this starts back over at 0. There's no resetting, there's no turning it on and off, you simply actuate the shutter. The problem is, they work great with film cameras because you can simply open up the back of the camera and place the photocell behind the shutter, aim it at a light source and trigger the shutter and test it. Not so easy to do with a modern DSLR because there's no back to open on the camera. If you were mechanically inclined and wanted to disassemble your DSLR to do that, you could probably do it, but it seems kind of impractical. And I think that most camera electronics, by the time you remove the electronics that were between the back of the camera and the camera wouldn't even function. So I was stuck with the problem of how to adapt this to a DSLR. And it suddenly struck me that the sensor that's in, or not the sensor, but the filter that's in front of the sensor looks like a piece of glass. So if you could shine a light down into it, you would see literally a reflection of the light, like you're looking in a mirror. And it struck me that the mirror boxes on most DSLRs are painted a dark color, usually a flat black. So I wondered if I could set this up to where the photocell was at the angle of reflectance to a light source and adjust the brightness of the light source where the light scattering around the mirror box didn't affect it, but as soon as the mirror came up and the shutter opened and you were actually, this photocell was actually looking at a reflection of the lamp, was enough light to trigger the timer. And I found out it works. So what I did was I set up my D60 here on the table. I used my helping hands to adjust my photocell. This was a cord that I custom made just for this purpose. And I've set the timer up, and I adjusted the light level to where, as I say, the light right now is not causing the timer to function, but once the mirror comes up and the shutter opens, exposing the sensor, there's enough light reflecting off the sensor to trigger the timer. Now I could use just that system, but I took it one step further, and I'm using tethering software. This allows me to use the software to simply adjust the shutter in the camera without having to pick the camera up, physically change the shutter, and set it back and realign everything. I can do it all over here. So I'm going to use a shutter speed, I'm going to choose one here, of 1/8 of a second, and take a sample shot. And 1/8 of a second, by the chart here, should be 0.125. Now I've got 0.15166. I fire it off again, I've got 0.15810. You may think that's off. You know, a difference between 12 and 15 is quite a bit, but there's a little chart here that tells me how far off I really am. So 1/8 of a second, 0.15, it tells me I'm about 1/3 of the stop slow, just 1/3 of a stop. May not make that big of a difference. Back in my film days, I used this extensively on my film cameras, and I found that one of my cameras, as it aged, the shutter actually slowed down to the point where it was, at some of the ranges of the shutter speeds, it was a full half stop off. In other words, I'd set the camera for 1 second, and it was giving me 1.6, 1.5, 1.4 seconds. Knowing that helped me nail exposures when I was manually setting this. I've even taken this one step further, and I'm going to start benchmarking these results into a spreadsheet. Every 2-3 months I'll set it up, do a bench test, and record the results on a database so I can start tracking to see how my shutter is actually aging over time, on how accurate it is, and whether it overexposes and underexposes at different shutter speeds. I made this little video, so hopefully this will give somebody an inspiration to try to do something like this. These shutter timers are extremely rare. There was only about 600 of them made, By the looks of them, they were made by hand, that weren't made in a factory, mass produced. They're just in a plastic hobby case, and all the connections and everything look like they were hand installed. But I'm sure somebody good enough with electronics would be able to figure out how to put a photocell onto a 555 timer chip and somehow incorporate that output into a simple digital output display. I know a lot of people are good with electronics. You might be able to duplicate what's here in this little box just with a little bit of internet research. Unfortunately, the company that made this from Minneapolis is out of business a long time ago. But I made this little video to show you that it is possible to actually test the shutter time on a modern digital single lens reflex.